The American Civil War killed more than 600,000 soldiers and nearly destroyed the nation. But buried inside that enormous tragedy are countless strange details that sound invented. Coincidences so unlikely they seem written by a novelist, medical discoveries made by accident. Battlefield moments so absurd they could be comedy if they were not surrounded by death. In this video, we will walk through 31 bizarre facts from the Civil War that sound made up, but are completely real. Some are dark, some are almost funny. All of them remind us that history is often stranger than any story we could invent. Number 1. The war began and ended on the same man's property. Wilmer McLean was a Virginia farmer whose property near Manassas became entangled with the war's first major battle in July 1861. A Union artillery shell reportedly crashed into his kitchen, while Confederate generals used his home as headquarters. The experience was terrifying enough that McLean decided to move his family far from the front lines to a quiet village called Appomattox Courthouse, where he believed the war would never reach. 4 years later, in April 1865, Confederate General Robert E. Lee needed a suitable building in which to surrender to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The building chosen was Wilmer McLean's parlor. The war had literally followed him from beginning to end. McLean reportedly said afterward that the war began in his front yard and ended in his front parlor. It sounds like fiction, but the house still stands today as part of the Appomattox Courthouse National Historical Park. Number 2. A future president was saved by a future presidential assassin's brother. Before John Wilkes Booth became infamous for killing Abraham Lincoln, his older brother Edwin Booth was one of the most celebrated actors in America. In a twist that seems impossible to believe, Edwin once saved the life of Robert Todd Lincoln, the president's eldest son. The incident occurred on a crowded train platform in Jersey City, New Jersey. Robert Lincoln was standing near the edge when the crowd pressed forward as a train began to move. He lost his footing and started to fall toward the tracks. Edwin Booth, standing nearby, grabbed the young man by the collar and pulled him back to safety. Robert recognized the famous actor and thanked him. Neither man could have known that Edwin's younger brother would soon kill Robert's father, forever changing American history. Number 3. The same man witnessed 3 presidential assassinations. Robert Todd Lincoln went on to have one of the strangest relationships with presidential tragedy in American history. He was present at or near 3 separate presidential assassinations. On April 14, 1865, Robert was at the White House and arrived at Ford's Theater shortly after his father was shot by John Wilkes Booth. 16 years later, in 1881, Robert Lincoln was serving as Secretary of War under President James Garfield. He was at the train station in Washington when Garfield was shot by assassin Charles Guidow. 20 years after that, in 1901, Robert Lincoln arrived at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo shortly after President William McKinley was shot by anarchist Leon C. Czolgosz. After 3 such experiences, Robert Lincoln reportedly declined future presidential invitations and avoided public events where presidents would appear. According to some accounts, he remarked that he seemed to be a bad luck charm for presidents. Number 4. There were 2 13th Amendments with opposite purposes. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery throughout the nation. But most people do not know that an earlier proposed 13th Amendment would have done exactly the opposite. The Corwin Amendment, proposed in early 1861 as a desperate attempt to prevent Southern secession, would have permanently protected slavery in states where it already existed. It would have forbidden the federal government from ever abolishing slavery in those states and put this protection beyond the reach of future constitutional amendments. Congress actually passed the Corwin Amendment and sent it to the states for ratification. President-elect Abraham Lincoln, hoping to preserve the Union, publicly endorsed sending it to the states. Ohio and Maryland ratified the amendment before the war made the entire proposal irrelevant. Two proposed 13th Amendments with completely opposite purposes, considered within the same decade. Number 5. Soldiers' wounds glowed in the dark, and those soldiers healed better. At the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862, thousands of wounded soldiers from both sides lay in muddy fields for 2 cold, rainy nights waiting for medical help. Some soldiers noticed something strange. Their wounds glowed faintly with a pale blue-green light in the darkness. Even stranger, soldiers with glowing wounds seemed to survive at higher rates and heal faster than those whose wounds did not glow. The phenomenon became known as angel's glow, and soldiers believed it was a miraculous sign of divine protection. More than a century later, researchers proposed a scientific explanation. A bioluminescent bacterium called Photorhabdus luminescens, which lives with parasitic nematodes in soil, may have colonized the wounds. This bacterium produces natural antibiotics that kill other bacteria. The cold, wet conditions at Shiloh may have lowered soldiers' body temperatures enough for the bacterium to thrive temporarily. What seemed supernatural was probably accidental battlefield medicine. Number 6. The Union Army used observation balloons, and it caused constant drama. The Union Army employed observation balloons to spy on Confederate positions, making the Civil War one of the first conflicts to use aerial reconnaissance. The chief balloonist was Thaddeus Lowe, a civilian aeronaut who convinced President Lincoln of the technology's value. But the balloon corps was plagued by problems that had nothing to do with the Confederates. The balloons required enormous quantities of hydrogen gas, special portable generators, large ground crews, and favorable weather. More importantly, military officers resented taking orders from a civilian scientist. Personality clashes were constant and bitter. At various points, the balloon corps was transferred between different branches of the Army because no one wanted responsibility for it. Lowe eventually resigned in frustration, and the program was effectively abandoned by 1863. The technology worked, but human problems nearly grounded the entire enterprise. Number 7. One of the South's greatest generals was killed by his own men. Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson was one of the most celebrated commanders of the Civil War. His nickname came from his steadfast defense at the First Battle of Bull Run. In May 1863, Jackson led a brilliant flanking march at Chancellorsville that resulted in a stunning Confederate victory. On the evening of May 2, after darkness had fallen, Jackson and his staff rode forward to scout Union positions in preparation for a dawn attack. As they returned toward their own lines, a group of nervous Confederate soldiers from a North Carolina regiment mistook the approaching riders for Union cavalry. In the darkness and confusion, they opened fire. Jackson was hit 3 times, twice in the left arm and once in the right hand. His left arm was amputated that night, and he initially seemed to be recovering, but he developed pneumonia and died 8 days later. One of the greatest generals of the Confederacy was killed not by Union forces, but by a tragic mistake made by his own soldiers returning from a victory. Number 8. Soldiers from both sides played baseball between battles. Baseball was already becoming popular in America before the war, especially in northeastern cities. When the war began, soldiers brought the game with them into camps. During lulls in fighting, soldiers from both armies organized games. Union prisoners in Confederate prison camps played baseball to pass time and maintain morale. Soldiers from rural areas who had never encountered the game learned the rules from city-raised comrades. Some historians credit the Civil War with spreading baseball across the entire country, as soldiers returned home after the war with a love for the game and taught it to their communities. The image is striking. Men who had just witnessed horrific violence would pick up bats and balls and play a game in the shadow of mass death. Number 9. A Confederate submarine sank an enemy ship and then immediately sank itself. The Confederate submarine H.L. Hunley holds a tragic place in naval history. It was one of the first combat submarines to successfully sink an enemy warship, but it never returned from that mission. Before its combat mission, the submarine had already sunk twice during testing, killing 2 complete crews including its namesake, Horace Lawson Hunley. On the night of February 17, 1864, the Hunley attacked the Union warship USS Housatonic using a spar torpedo, essentially a bomb mounted on a long pole. The attack succeeded. The Housatonic sank in 5 minutes, but the Hunley never returned to shore. It sank that night with all 8 crew members aboard. The submarine was lost for over a century until it was located in 1995 and raised in 2000. Researchers are still studying what caused its final sinking, with theories ranging from damage from the explosion to the crew suffocating. The Hunley was as dangerous to its own crew as to the enemy. Number 10. President Lincoln dreamed of his own death days before he was assassinated. According to accounts from those close to him, Abraham Lincoln told friends and family about a disturbing dream he had just days before his assassination. In the dream, Lincoln wandered through the White House and heard the sounds of weeping and mourning. He followed the sounds until he found a corpse lying in state in the East Room, surrounded by soldiers acting as guards. When Lincoln asked one of the soldiers who had died, the soldier replied that it was the president, who had been killed by an assassin. Lincoln reportedly found the dream disturbing, but told those around him that he did not necessarily consider it prophetic. Less than 2 weeks later, on the night of April 14, 1865, Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. Number 11. Confederate agents tried to burn down New York City. In November 1864, 8 Confederate agents infiltrated New York City with a dramatic plan. They would set fire to multiple hotels and public buildings simultaneously, creating chaos and panic in the Union's largest city. The agents checked into various hotels across Manhattan and used a chemical mixture called Greek fire to ignite blazes in their rooms. On the night of November 25, they set fires in at least 19 locations, including major hotels and Barnum's American Museum. The attack failed primarily because the agents did not understand fire behavior. In most cases, they closed the windows and doors of the hotel rooms before leaving, which starved the fires of oxygen and prevented them from spreading. The fires smoldered and were quickly discovered and extinguished. No one was killed, and damage was relatively limited. Number 12. One Union general was considered a Confederate asset because he was so bad. Ambrose Burnside is remembered for 2 things: his distinctive facial hair, which gave us the word sideburns, and his disastrous military leadership. Burnside was a likable man who repeatedly told his superiors that he did not feel qualified for high command. They promoted him anyway. In December 1862, at the Battle of Fredericksburg, Burnside ordered wave after wave of Union soldiers to attack a nearly impregnable Confederate position on Mary's Heights. The result was a catastrophic slaughter, with more than 12,000 Union casualties compared to roughly 5,000 for the Confederacy. Some historians noted, only partly joking, that Burnside's incompetence did more to help the Confederate cause than many Southern generals managed. Number 13. Harriet Tubman led an armed military raid during the war. Harriet Tubman is famous for her work on the Underground Railroad, but her service during the Civil War itself is less well known. Tubman worked for the Union Army as a nurse, cook, and scout. She also developed networks of spies and informants among enslaved people in Confederate territory. In June 1863, Tubman became the first woman in American history to lead an armed military assault when she guided Union gunboats on the Combahee River raid in South Carolina. The raid, planned using intelligence Tubman had gathered, destroyed Confederate supplies and freed more than 700 enslaved people who were brought to Union lines. Tubman was not formally recognized for her military service with a pension until decades later. Number 14. Some soldiers survived being shot in the head. Civil War medicine was primitive by modern standards, but some soldiers survived wounds that should have been fatal. There are documented cases of men who were shot in the head and lived for years or even decades afterward. The relatively low velocity of Civil War bullets compared to modern ammunition, combined with unusual angles of impact, occasionally allowed survival. Some bullets lodged in the skull without penetrating the brain deeply. Others passed through areas that, while serious, did not immediately kill. These survivors often suffered lasting consequences: severe headaches, seizures, partial paralysis, vision problems, and dramatic personality changes. But they lived when by all odds they should have died. Number 15. A general kept fighting after having a leg amputated. Confederate General Richard Ewell lost his left leg at the Second Battle of Bull Run in August 1862. A bullet shattered his knee, and surgeons were forced to amputate. Rather than retiring from military service, Ewell was fitted with a wooden leg and returned to duty. He commanded a corps at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863 and continued serving until near the end of the war. The sight of a one-legged general on horseback, leading troops into battle, became a symbol of Confederate determination. Amputation was tragically common during the Civil War, and many amputees returned to active roles in society, and sometimes even in combat. Number 16. Soldiers traded coffee and tobacco across enemy lines. Despite the horrific violence of the war, moments of humanity sometimes emerged between enemy soldiers. Union soldiers generally had access to coffee, a precious commodity that Confederate soldiers desperately craved. Confederate soldiers, meanwhile, often had tobacco that Union soldiers wanted. Rather than simply killing each other, pickets from opposing armies sometimes arranged trades. The exchanges happened in various ways. Soldiers would meet in no man's land during unofficial truces, float packages across rivers using small boats, or leave goods at designated spots. Officers sometimes looked the other way because the trades reduced tension. The phenomenon reminds us that ordinary soldiers were often just young men caught in a war they did not start. Number 17. The Confederacy built their most famous ironclad from a sunken Union ship. When Union forces abandoned the Gosport Navy Yard in Norfolk, Virginia in April 1861, they tried to destroy everything of value. One of the ships they burned and scuttled was the steam frigate USS Merrimack. But the Confederates raised the burned hulk from the shallow harbor and rebuilt it as an ironclad warship, renaming it the CSS Virginia. In March 1862, the Virginia emerged to attack wooden Union ships blockading Hampton Roads. It sank 2 warships and ran a third aground, creating panic in the Union Navy. The next day, the Union's own ironclad, the USS Monitor, arrived and fought the Virginia to a draw in the famous Battle of Hampton Roads. The engagement changed naval warfare forever, proving that wooden warships were obsolete. Number 18. Doctors used maggots to clean wounds, and it actually worked. Civil War surgeons noticed a strange phenomenon. Soldiers whose wounds became infested with maggots sometimes healed better than those with clean wounds. The explanation is that certain species of maggots eat only dead, decaying tissue and leave healthy tissue alone. By consuming the dead flesh, they effectively cleaned wounds and removed the breeding ground for dangerous bacteria. Most doctors found the practice repulsive and tried to remove maggots from wounds. But some Confederate surgeons, facing severe shortages of medical supplies, deliberately introduced maggots to infected wounds with positive results. Maggot therapy has since been validated by modern medicine and is still used today to treat certain kinds of wounds. Number 19. Abraham Lincoln created the Secret Service the night he was killed. On April 14, 1865, just hours before he went to Ford's Theater, President Abraham Lincoln signed legislation creating the United States Secret Service. However, the original purpose was not presidential protection but combating counterfeit currency, which had become a massive problem during the war. The Secret Service did not take on presidential protection duties until 1901, after the assassination of President McKinley. Lincoln created an agency that would eventually exist specifically to prevent presidential assassinations on the very night he would be assassinated. He died the following morning, never knowing the agency he created would one day be synonymous with protecting presidents. Number 20. A Confederate spy hid messages in her hair. Rose O'Neal Greenhow was a wealthy Washington socialite with connections to powerful politicians. When the Civil War began, she became one of the Confederacy's most valuable spies. Using her social position, Greenhow gathered intelligence about Union military plans. She reportedly hid messages in her elaborate hairstyles, using the complex structures fashionable at the time to conceal documents. Her intelligence may have contributed to the Confederate victory at the First Battle of Bull Run. She was eventually arrested and imprisoned, but even in captivity, she continued to smuggle information. After her release, she traveled to Europe on a diplomatic mission for the Confederacy. In 1864, returning from Europe on a blockade runner, her ship ran aground while trying to evade a Union vessel. Greenhow drowned, reportedly weighed down by gold coins she was carrying for the Confederate cause. Number 21. A 12-year-old drummer boy became the youngest Medal of Honor recipient. Willie Johnston enlisted in the Union Army as a drummer boy when he was just 11 years old. Drummer boys served vital roles in communication and morale, as drums were used to signal commands on noisy battlefields. During the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, Johnston's unit retreated in chaos after a series of defeats. Most of the regiment's drummers abandoned their drums to make their escape easier. Johnston, despite being the youngest drummer in the regiment, held onto his drum throughout the retreat. For this act of dedication and bravery, Willie Johnston was awarded the Medal of Honor at age 13, making him the youngest recipient of that award for Civil War service. Number 22. Photographers moved bodies to create better pictures. Alexander Gardner was one of the most famous photographers of the Civil War. His images from battlefields like Antietam and Gettysburg shaped how Americans understood the war's horror. But Gardner and his team sometimes moved bodies and props to create more dramatic compositions. At Gettysburg, researchers have identified the same corpse photographed in different locations with different captions. A body described as a Confederate sharpshooter in one image appears to have been moved from another location and posed with a rifle. This complicates our understanding of Civil War photography as pure documentation. Even the earliest war photography involved staging and artistic choices. Number 23. The Confederacy almost bought powerful warships from Britain. The Confederacy desperately needed a navy and turned to Britain for help. British shipyards built commerce raiders for the Confederacy, including the CSS Alabama, which devastated Union merchant shipping. The Confederacy also attempted to purchase powerful ironclad warships called Laird rams, designed specifically for ramming and sinking enemy ships. The Union put enormous diplomatic pressure on Britain to stop the sales, threatening war if the ships were delivered. Britain eventually backed down and seized the rams before they could reach Confederate hands. If the ships had been delivered, they might have broken the Union naval blockade and changed the course of the war. Number 24. Soldiers sometimes recognized family members fighting for the other side. The phrase brother against brother was not just a metaphor. The Civil War literally divided families, especially those from border states where loyalties were split. There are documented cases of brothers fighting on opposite sides, sometimes in the same battle. Some accounts describe brief informal truces where relatives met, embraced, and exchanged news before returning to their units to continue fighting. Other accounts are more tragic. Soldiers who discovered only after a battle that they had killed a brother, cousin, or childhood friend. The war divided the nation, but it also tore apart the most intimate bonds of blood and friendship. Number 25. One battle was briefly paused, so soldiers could watch a fistfight. During the Siege of Petersburg in 1864, opposing pickets from Union and Confederate lines sometimes came close enough to talk, trade, and even joke with each other. According to some accounts, a dispute between a Union soldier and a Confederate soldier led to a challenge. They would settle their argument with their fists rather than bullets. Fighting along the lines briefly paused as men from both sides gathered to watch the two soldiers box. After the fight ended, with honor apparently satisfied on both sides, the soldiers returned to their positions and resumed trying to kill each other. Number 26. The war produced America's first income tax. The Civil War was extraordinarily expensive, and the federal government needed new sources of revenue. In 1861, Congress passed the Revenue Act, which introduced the first federal income tax in American history. The initial tax was set at 3% on annual incomes over $800, a substantial threshold that meant only the relatively wealthy paid. The tax was controversial from the start, with critics arguing it was unconstitutional. It was eventually repealed after the war ended, but the precedent had been set. The modern income tax system, established permanently by the 16th Amendment in 1913, has its roots in the financial desperation of the Civil War era. Number 27. A general war arose into battle and died holding it. Confederate General J.E.B. Stuart was one of the most flamboyant figures of the Civil War, known for his plumed hat, his cape, and his dashing cavalry raids. At the Battle of Yellow Tavern on May 11, 1864, Stuart was mortally wounded by a dismounted Union cavalryman. According to some accounts, Stuart had a rose tucked into his buttonhole during the fighting, a gift from a female admirer. Stuart was carried from the field and taken to Richmond, where he died the next day at age 31. The detail about the rose may be embellished over time, but Stuart's theatrical approach to warfare was entirely real. Number 28. The Emancipation Proclamation did not free anyone immediately. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, issued on January 1, 1863, is celebrated as the document that freed enslaved people, but its immediate practical effect was more complicated. The proclamation applied only to enslaved people in Confederate states that were in active rebellion. It specifically exempted enslaved people in border states loyal to the Union and in areas already under Union military control. Since the Confederacy did not recognize Lincoln's authority, the proclamation could not actually free anyone in rebel territory by itself. Freedom came only as Union armies advanced and enforced the proclamation. The document was as much a military strategy as a moral declaration. Number 29. Both armies executed deserters in front of their comrades. Desertion was a massive problem for both armies during the Civil War. Soldiers fled for many reasons: fear, homesickness, war weariness, or knowledge that their families were suffering at home. Both the Union and Confederate armies executed deserters, often by firing squad. To maximize the deterrent effect, executions were sometimes carried out publicly. Entire regiments were ordered to assemble and watch as a condemned man was shot by his own comrades. The practice was considered necessary to maintain discipline, but it created its own trauma. Men who had survived battle were forced to watch their own army kill a man whose crime was wanting to go home. Number 30. Thousands of soldiers simply vanished without a trace. The Civil War produced unprecedented casualties, and the chaos of battle meant that record-keeping was often incomplete. Thousands of soldiers were listed as missing and were never accounted for. Some died in battle and were buried in unmarked graves, their identities unknown. Some were captured and died in prison camps where records were poorly kept. Some deserted and disappeared into new lives under new names. Some were simply lost in the confusion of war. Their bodies never recovered, their fates never determined. For families left behind, the uncertainty was agonizing. The scale of the unknown dead was one of the reasons the federal government established national cemeteries after the war. Number 31. The same man's house was stripped by souvenir hunters after the surrender. We return to Wilmer McLean, whose house witnessed both the war's beginning and end. After Lee's surrender in McLean's parlor, Union officers and soldiers immediately began taking souvenirs from the room. They carried off furniture, pieces of upholstery, fragments of wallpaper, and anything else they could manage as mementos of the historic moment. McLean tried to profit from his strange place in history by selling relics, but he eventually fell into financial difficulty and lost the house. His story endures because it reminds us that history happens to ordinary people in their kitchens and parlors, whether they want it to or not. The American Civil War lasted 4 years and reshaped the nation in ways that still echo today. But buried in that enormous history are countless strange moments, coincidences that seem designed by a storyteller, medical discoveries made by accident, moments of humanity across enemy lines, and tragedies that echo across generations. These bizarre facts do not diminish the war's significance. If anything, they remind us that history is made by real people in real moments, full of contradictions, accidents, and surprises. The neat narratives we learn in school are always simplifications. The truth is messier, stranger, and often harder to believe than fiction. The next time someone tells you that history is boring, remember that the same man's property saw both the war's first major battle and its final surrender. Remember that a future assassin's brother saved the son of the man his brother would kill. Remember that soldiers' wounds glowed in the dark. Remember that men traded coffee for tobacco across lines where they had just been trying to kill each other. History is not boring. It is stranger than anything we could invent. We just have to look closely enough to see it.